In today's video, I bring an intriguing story about Eduardo, a young man who faced a series of unexpected challenges. Want to know what he discovered about his own family? Stay until the end to uncover this mystery. Eduardo was only 10 years old when his life changed drastically. His mother, Maria, was a loving and dedicated woman who always put her family's well-being above all else. She was the heart of the home, a constant and caring presence that Eduardo deeply admired. Unfortunately, Maria was diagnosed with a severe illness, which gradually weakened her, making each day a challenge for her and the family. During her battle with the illness, Maria remained strong and resilient. Even in her most fragile moments, she found the strength to comfort Eduardo, who accompanied her whenever he could. They spent hours together, talking, reading stories, and sharing moments that Eduardo would cherish forever in his heart. Maria was his confidant and friend, and Eduardo couldn't imagine his life without her. As Maria fought for her life, Eduardo's father, Ricardo, became increasingly distant. What Eduardo didn't know was that Ricardo, unable to cope with the situation, had sought comfort outside the home. He started an affair with another woman, a relationship that flourished in secret while Maria was still fighting for her life. Ricardo justified his actions as a search for relief, but the reality was that he was betraying his wife in her most vulnerable moment. Maria's illness progressed rapidly, and the family faced difficult days. Eduardo saw his mother growing weaker, and although he tried to be strong, the pain was overwhelming. Ricardo's presence at home became less frequent, and when he was there, he seemed absent, lost in his own thoughts and worries. The day of farewell came abruptly. Maria, exhausted and weakened, left this world, and with her, the light that illuminated Eduardo's life. The funeral was a moment of deep sadness but also of farewell and painful acceptance. Eduardo held his mother's hand for the last time, promising himself he would never forget her teachings and the love she gave him. A few days after Maria's death, Ricardo made a shocking decision. He abandoned Eduardo, leaving the boy in the care of his maternal grandparents, Teresa and João. Without a clear explanation, Ricardo said goodbye with few words and left, as if he were leaving behind a chapter he no longer wanted to read. Eduardo, still mourning the loss of his mother, now faced his father's abandonment, feeling betrayed and lost. Teresa and João, Eduardo's grandparents, welcomed him with open arms. They were also grieving the loss of their daughter but did their best to create a safe and loving environment for Eduardo. They were simple people but with huge hearts, who did everything to fill the void left by Maria and Ricardo. Eduardo, now living with his grandparents, had to mature quickly. He dealt with the pain of losing his mother and the feeling of abandonment by his father. The nights were long and lonely, and he often wondered what he had done wrong to deserve so much suffering. Teresa and João did their best to offer emotional support, but they knew Eduardo needed to face his pain to heal. When Eduardo turned 18, fate brought another tragedy into his life, the death of his grandfather, João. João had been more than a grandfather to Eduardo. He was a father figure, a mentor, and a close friend. Since Maria's death, João had dedicated himself to raising Eduardo with wisdom and love, instilling in him important values and a strong work ethic. He was a man of principles, known for his integrity and generosity in the small community where they lived. João had worked hard all his life. He started as a farmer on a small rural property, but over time, he invested in land and learned to manage resources with great skill. His discipline and foresight allowed him to accumulate a considerable fortune, something he never flaunted but used to ensure a better future for his family. João firmly believed in the importance of education and the value of honest work. Joao's loss was a devastating blow to Eduardo. In addition to losing the last remaining family member, he lost his guide and mentor. Eduardo remembered the long walks through the fields, where Joao taught him about the land, the importance of caring for nature, and respecting all forms of life. Joao's stories about his difficult youth and how he worked tirelessly to overcome challenges were inspirations that Eduardo carried with him. On the day of the funeral, Eduardo felt a mixture of deep sadness and gratitude. The ceremony was simple, as Joao always preferred, and was attended by many friends and neighbors who came to pay their respects. Beside the grave, Eduardo made a silent promise to his grandfather. He would honor Joao's memory and live according to the values he had taught him. Shortly after the funeral, Eduardo was called to a meeting with the family lawyer. There, he discovered that Joao had left him a substantial inheritance. This inheritance was not only financial but also included properties and investments that Joao had carefully cultivated over the years. Eduardo was amazed at the magnitude of the legacy his grandfather had left. He knew that this inheritance was the result of a lifetime of hard work and prudent financial decisions. However, the inheritance came with great responsibility. Still dealing with grief, Eduardo felt the weight of the expectation to live up to his grandfather's legacy. He knew he couldn't simply live carelessly. He needed to honor Joao's work and sacrifices. Eduardo decided to use the inherited resources to educate himself and prepare for the future. Determined to follow in his grandfather's footsteps, Eduardo enrolled in a business management course, aiming to better understand how to manage his assets and make wise financial decisions. He also began to get involved in community projects, inspired by Joao's example of generosity. Eduardo wanted to make a difference in the lives of those around him, just as his grandfather had done. Days after Joao's funeral, while Eduardo was still processing the loss and trying to find his way, an unexpected presence emerged in his life: his father, Ricardo. Ricardo's appearance was a shock to Eduardo, who hadn't seen his father since the abandonment years ago. His last memory of Ricardo was of an absent man who had chosen to leave during a time of pain and need. Now, he was back, bringing with him a mix of complex and confusing emotions. The reunion occurred on a rainy afternoon, while Eduardo was at home, trying to organize his grandfather's belongings. The doorbell rang, and when he opened the door, Eduardo saw Ricardo and a woman he didn't know. It was the same woman Ricardo had been involved with in the past, a figure representing the reason he had abandoned Eduardo and his mother. The sight of his father, now accompanied by this woman, brought a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Ricardo, trying to remain calm and appear sincere, began to speak. He expressed regret for his past actions, claiming that he had been immature and unable to handle the situation at the time. He said that since learning of Eduardo's grandfather's death, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about his son and how he had abandoned him. The woman beside Ricardo remained silent, just observing Eduardo's reaction. Ricardo continued his speech, explaining that he wanted a second chance to be the father he never was. He claimed that, despite past mistakes, he had always loved Eduardo and was willing to do whatever it took to redeem himself. Ricardo asked for forgiveness, stating that he wanted to be a part of Eduardo's life again and that they could build a new relationship together. Eduardo, still shaken by the recent loss and the new responsibilities now on his shoulders, felt confused. On one hand, there was the desire to have a father figure, something he had always missed since his mother's death and his father's abandonment. On the other hand, the presence of the woman with whom Ricardo had betrayed his mother brought a renewed pain, as if the wound had never really healed. Eduardo's expression was a mix of distrust and hope. He wanted to believe Ricardo's words, to believe that people could change and that he could have a present father in his life. The memories of his mother, who always taught Eduardo to forgive and see the good in people, weighed on his heart. Despite everything, Eduardo decided to give his father a chance, perhaps hoping to fill the void he had felt since childhood. Eduardo began, his voice trembling. I will give you a chance, but know that it won't be easy. A lot has happened, and I can't just forget. Ricardo nodded, seemingly understanding. He promised to do his best to regain Eduardo's trust, assuring him that his intentions were sincere. Eduardo, still unsure but wanting to believe in a possible redemption, agreed to keep in contact with his father and allow him to come closer. However, the joy of reuniting with his father was short-lived. One night, Eduardo decided to make a surprise visit to Ricardo's house, hoping to spend some time together and strengthen the relationship they were trying to rebuild. As he approached the door, now darkening, he heard voices coming from inside. Eduardo hesitated before knocking, feeling a strange sense of unease. Curious and concerned, he moved closer to the slightly open door and clearly heard his father's and stepmother's voices. What he heard next made his heart sink and his blood run cold. Ricardo was talking about how they needed to act carefully so Eduardo wouldn't suspect their true intentions. He mentioned that Eduardo was vulnerable and emotionally shaken by his recent loss, and that this was an opportunity they couldn't pass up. Eduardo's stepmother, who had previously seemed friendly and understanding, agreed with Ricardo, detailing how they could approach Eduardo to gain his trust. We need to be patient, Ricardo said, with a coldness Eduardo had not noticed before. We can't scare him off, or he might become suspicious. We need to make it seem like we're genuinely concerned about him, that we want what's best for him. That way, when he feels secure, it will be easier to convince him to make financial decisions that benefit all of us. Eduardo felt a sharp pain in his chest. The agony of hearing his father, whom he believed was sincerely remorseful, talking about him as if he were just a pawn in a game, was unbearable. He stood there, frozen, paralyzed by the betrayal unfolding before his ears. The weight of Ricardo and his stepmother's words crushed him, making it hard to even breathe. The trust he had begun to rebuild towards his father shattered in an instant. As the conversation continued, Eduardo felt betrayed and used. Tears began to stream down his face as shock and disillusionment overwhelmed him. He had believed his father's words of regret, allowing him to come closer, yearning for a connection he had never had. But now, the harsh truth struck him with force. His father didn't see him as a beloved son, but as a financial opportunity. Eduardo silently backed away from the door, unable to listen any longer. Every word felt like a poison eating away at his hope and innocence. He felt utterly alone, more so than ever. The father figure he had longed for had revealed himself as a fraud, a facade built on empty promises and calculated lies. The stepmother, whom he had thought could be a possible ally, was clearly involved in the manipulation plan. This revelation left Eduardo devastated. He felt foolish for believing that Ricardo could really change. The weight of the betrayal was overwhelming, and Eduardo could hardly believe that his own father, to whom he had begun to give a second chance, was only interested in his money. The pain was deep, mixed with a sense of shame for being so easily deceived. With a broken heart and a mind in turmoil, Eduardo walked away from the house, feeling lost and betrayed. What little faith he had left in his father's goodness was destroyed, and he knew he would have to make a difficult decision about how to deal with this revelation. And what do you think Eduardo should do? Leave your opinion in the comments. Days after overhearing the revealing conversation between his father and stepmother, Eduardo decided he needed to confront Ricardo and expose what he had discovered. The pain and anger boiled inside him, but he knew he needed to stay calm and be clear about his feelings and intentions. He arranged a meeting with Ricardo and the stepmother, pretending he wanted to discuss the future and how they could reconnect as a family. The meeting took place on a sunny afternoon at Ricardo's house. Eduardo arrived with a serious expression, his heart pounding as he tried to control the avalanche of emotions. Ricardo and the stepmother greeted him with smiles and hugs, acting as if they were a united, loving family. Eduardo sat down, staring intently at his father, trying to find some humanity or genuine remorse in his eyes. But what he found was a coldness and calculation that only made him more determined. Eduardo took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice firm and controlled. He recounted how he had overheard the conversation the other night and, in cold and precise detail, repeated the words that had been said, exposing Ricardo and his stepmother's plan to take over his inheritance. Eduardo watched his father closely, hoping to see some spark of shame or guilt. However, Ricardo maintained an impassive expression, only occasionally exchanging glances with the stepmother, who was clearly uncomfortable. "So, is that it?" Eduardo asked, his voice laden with pain and disappointment. "All you wanted was my money. All that talk about regret and wanting to be a family again, it was all a lie." Realizing he could no longer maintain the facade, Ricardo sighed and leaned back in his chair. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost disdainful. "Eduardo, you have to understand that life is complicated. I made mistakes, yes, but what matters now is the future. We're trying to secure a good future for all of us. And to do that, we need to be smart with the resources we have." Eduardo felt a wave of nausea hearing his father's cold and calculating justification. He looked at his stepmother, hoping she would say something, but she just looked at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. The lack of any remorse or empathy in Ricardo's eyes confirmed for Eduardo that he could never trust his father again. "You can't be serious," Eduardo said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You two were planning to manipulate me, use my money, and now you act like it's just a matter of business." Ricardo shrugged, as if dealing with a child who couldn't understand the adult world. "Eduardo, we're trying to be practical. You need us to manage this inheritance. You don't know how to do it on your own." This last statement was the breaking point for Eduardo. He stood up abruptly, his face flushed with indignation. "I don't need anyone who just wants to use me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I've taken all the precautions to protect my assets. I've talked to a lawyer and taken measures to ensure that none of this falls into your hands. You're not getting anything from me." Ricardo tried to intervene, reaching out as if to calm Eduardo, but the young man pulled back, stepping away. "No!" Eduardo cut him off, his voice firm and filled with new determination. "I don't need your apologies or your explanations. It's over. You both used me, lied to me, and now you want to benefit from it. I won't allow it." With those words, Eduardo turned and walked out of the house, not looking back. He knew any attempt at reconciliation was completely shattered. Ricardo's coldness and calculation had severed any emotional ties Eduardo might still have had with his father. Eduardo felt relieved for having taken steps to protect his assets, but the pain of betrayal still weighed heavily on his heart. Outside, Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. After the devastating confrontation, Eduardo decided to cut all ties with his father and stepmother. Ricardo's coldness and calculation, along with the lack of remorse, left Eduardo with no doubt that there was no room for reconciliation. He blocked his father's phone number, avoided any communication, and refused to respond to any messages or emails that Ricardo and the stepmother sent. Ricardo tried multiple times to reconnect, using different tactics, from apologies to promises of change. But Eduardo, now more aware and determined, stood firm in his resolution. He knew that any attempt at reconciliation would only be another manipulation attempt. Eduardo made the decision never to seek out his father again. Ricardo made several attempts to re-establish contact, but all were unsuccessful, as Eduardo had taken all necessary measures to protect himself and his assets. He focused on moving forward, dedicating himself to his studies and personal projects, aiming to build a future that reflected the values he had learned from his grandparents. Despite it being a difficult choice and the deep scars left by his father's betrayal, Eduardo was determined not to let the past define his life. He chose to surround himself with people who truly cared about him and to follow a path of integrity and determination. Thus, Eduardo continued his journey, leaving behind a relationship that, despite the blood ties, had never truly been a family to him.